Thank you, Sandra, and everyone in the community for inviting me to share with you again. It's really an honor, and I look forward to these events, even though sometimes I get nervous ahead of time. I would just like to say that when we first talked about this, I was given the opportunity to choose between a couple different lecture series, and it was easy for me to choose the cycle of the year because this particular set of lectures has been really important for me. And I'll just share briefly biographically why that is. And in reflecting on my own life, it's very evident to me that when I was 9 years old, one of the most remarkable experiences I had was waking up to the mystery of the calendar. I had been given a book of quizzes and puzzles and for my birthday, and I was hiding in my closet because I have 5 brothers, and they were, they always like to wrestle and take things out of your hands. So I went into my closet to look at this book, and I flipped to the back, and there was a perpetual calendar in the back that had the lists of different things that had happened on different days throughout the cycle of the year. And I flipped to my birthday and read that Ponce de Leon discovered Florida, seeking the fountain of youth on my birthday. I was astounded, and I thought to myself, you mean you can know what happened every day in all of history? I couldn't believe it. It just, this door flew open. And then, 20 or so years later, I was at the Rudolf Steiner house in Ann Arbor, and Hazel Straker was giving a lecture about the great conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter and its relationship to the conversion of Saul at the gates of Damascus. And I had the same kind of experience. You mean you can know the star picture behind everything that happens? And of course, I mean, now I can say, well, of course, because that is a reality, but the bridge had not been built in my thinking from the events that were happening on the earth to the events that were taking place in the heavens, and to this record that we have in this beautiful mystery of the calendar, which is like a time machine that allows us to, from the present moment, either look as far back in the past as we can in recorded history, or plan as far ahead in the future as we would like. I mean, this is a remarkable tool. And so when I was asked about giving this talk tonight, I said, well, of course, the cycle of the year, because here in these lectures, Rudolf Steiner gives a very beautiful setup for how we are to live with the year and to become festival creating and to do the esoteric. This is such an invitation. And the setup for it is to become cognizant of what is the cycle of the year and how do we live with that. And so one of the things I'd like to for us to just ask ourselves, and we had kind of talked about it in the as we were gathering for the moment to start, is whether or not we actually know where the moon is right now and what phase is it in. And no cheating, no looking at devices, but to really just ask ourselves, where is moon right now? Is it above the horizon where I am? Is it below? And is it waxing? Is it waning? Where is it going? What is it doing? We are traditionally halfway through the season at this point. And so this is a really significant time in looking at the phase of moon, because if you didn't have a calendar or weren't as reliant on it the way we are in contemporary culture for making plans into the future, you might be watching the moon to try to figure out how many days before the frost is going to stop and how many days before we get to the spring moon, so that then we can start to do those festivals of the spring. And not being connected to what's happening in the natural environment really cuts us off from being able to understand how to celebrate the festival. So I'm going to start sharing my screen right now. And what I want to do is not really just to repeat what Rudolf Steiner says in these beautiful lectures, because Rudolf Steiner can say it much more beautifully, but I will give just a brief pointing at what's in each one of these chapters. And I don't expect that everyone read them all before we came to tonight, but just to give a very brief overview. And then what I want to do is share how I'm looking into this particular year with this as a backdrop. So the cycle of the year, living with the being of the year. And these lectures were given in 1923, so 100 years ago this year. But I want to start with something that Rudolf Steiner said at the end of 1922. And so we've all just, are, I'm sure, well aware that we've just passed through the 100th anniversary of the fire that destroyed the first Goethe Annum. And it's very interesting from this perspective to look at what Rudolf Steiner was saying that evening. So this is just toward the end of the lecture that was being given on December 31st, 1922. Spiritual knowledge is thus a veritable communion, the beginning of a cosmic ritual that is right and fitting for the man of today, who is then able to grow because he begins to realize how he permeates his own physical and etheric organism with his astral body and ego, and how, as he quickens the spirit in himself, he charms it also into the dead and dying matter that surrounds him, and a new experience is then his. So the reason I want to point at this is that his description, this communion and this beginning of a description of a cosmic ritual. He goes on then to say the first beginning of what must come to pass if anthroposophy is to fulfill its mission in the world is that man's whole relationship to the world must be recognized to be one of cosmic ritual. This is a really strong statement. And so it, of course, makes one question, what is a cosmic ritual? What is that? What does that look like as a human being that is living in ideally direct relationship with the natural environment and is aware where the moon is, where we are in the cycle of the season? How do I bring ritual out of that kind of knowledge? And if I don't have access to that knowledge, then what am I being cut off from? And then he ends toward the end of this particular lecture. I have wished to say this to you, as it were, as a beginning. Now remember, this is the last lecture he gave in the first Goethe Annum. I'm saying this to you as a beginning. Next Friday, I will speak further about the nature of this ritual in its relation to a real knowledge of nature. I appointed this lecture for this particular day with a special end in view. For today, when that being of time, which is given in the cycle of the year, is brought before our souls, when this year, at any rate for outward perception and experience, comes to an end, we should realize the nature of our relationship to time, how it rests with us out of the past to form and shape the future, to work actively for the future in order to create in the spirit. So if you look at the lecture that Rudolf Steiner gave on the Friday following this statement, where he says, next Friday, I'm going to develop this further, he didn't talk about the cosmic ritual. He didn't make a reference to this lecture. I allow myself to imagine that this series of lectures on the cycle of the year is his answer to what he intended to develop further, because he enters into this description of how the human being in ancient cultures lived in relationship to the celestial environment out of a sense of space, and that through the mystery of Golgotha, the human being is as though torn out of space and thrust into time. And this serves as a backdrop for then how the festival of observing something like Easter can be informed. And so on New Year's Eve, 1922, he was setting up this description of the cosmic ritual and saying, okay, I'm going to talk about this again in a few days, but then the fire happened. And when those few days elapsed, he did not take it up again. But then at the beginning of April that year, or right at the end of March, he started this series of lectures on the cycle of the year. So the cycle of the year lectures, I know it as the cycle of the year as a breathing process of the earth, as the full title. And that's what the first lecture really addresses, where there's this setup about not just the earth breathing oxygen or breathing air, but that its forces are as though drawn in, and a full inhalation at winter solstice in the darkest time of the year in the Northern Hemisphere. This is in December. And then this exhalation that comes with the summer solstice at the time of St. John's. And as I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time describing each one of these lectures. I just want to point to what for me stands out as one of the highlights in the lecture. And in this first lecture, in addition to talking about the in-breath and the out-breath, or you could say the in-breathing of the earth forces and the out-breathing of the earth forces, there's also a description of how the ancient initiates at the ancient time would read what was happening in the cosmos in the relationship of the planets to the stars and the sunlight as it was reflected toward them through the moon. But then with the incarnation of the Christ being on the earth, it's no longer valid to look for what's happening in the celestial spiritual world as though you could read it through the moonlight, but that now there is an experience of the sun that the Christ brings to the earth, and we begin to experience it actually from the earth. So this is what is touched on or described in the first lecture that was given on March 31st, which in 1923 was Holy Saturday. And I really like to point this out because this series of lectures is about how to find the festival cycle in the year. And how do we really live with that? And how do we really discern the nature of the year by looking at when the festivals occur? The second lecture in this series was given on April 1st, which was Easter Sunday that year. And this is the lecture in which Rudolf Steiner really says that we are to become festival creating and that we are to do the esoteric. So this is a real declarative statement about how once we can become aware of the cycle of the year and how we can live with the cycle of the year, that we can begin to use this to create a festival. So that what I imagine is that we're not just relying on tradition, and we're not just relying on the calendar, because really if we ask ourselves, how is it that I know what the date of Easter is this year? How will I figure that out if I don't already know what it is? Am I going to Google it? Am I going to rely on an email? Am I going to is it on a calendar somewhere? Can I find it in nature? Can I find it in myself? What is Easter as a lived mystery and an experience that happens anew again and again from one year to the next? I feel like this is what Rudolf Steiner is asking us to do, to become festival creating out of a relationship to the cycle of the year, and to not just rely on tradition, but to understand where does the tradition come from and is it informing my experience? This is what the calendar of the soul is as well. It's a speaking to the cycle of the year that's moving such that it stays living. You know, it doesn't begin on the same date every year. So we've got to move and adjust in the cycle of the year to find the verse that corresponds with where we are. And it's meant to be a guide so that I'm both experiencing nature and contemplating these verses and adjusting them according to what is my sense of what's happening in the natural world. Then April 2nd, which was Easter Monday, the next lecture is then where he really starts to describe the Michael festival, this festival of courage. There's a really, really lovely description of the threefoldness and a description of why he wrote the book Theosophy the way he did, and how the standing behind the threefold nature is the Trinity. And that while we can oftentimes think of the year in quarters, that's not true to what's actually expressing itself as a living reality in our experience of the divine Trinity. So this is addressed in that third lecture. The fourth lecture was given on April 3rd, in which Rudolf Steiner says something I think is quite beautiful. We are connected with heaven. I'd like to say that a different way. We are connected with heaven. And the festivals are a way of communicating or communing between the earthly and the heavenly. So coming from that thought, then potentially creating a cosmic ritual becomes a little bit closer to being a reality. And then the last lecture was given on Wednesday, April 4th, 1923. And here he goes through the 4 major festivals in the year and then gives a description of what would be contemplated through each of those festivals. Receiving the light, and he's given the background of describing how at St. John's time there was an experience of the egoic forces of the human being. Michaelmas, look around you, experience what's happening in the decline of nature, but how the human being awakens from within. And then at Christmas, beware of evil, and that which lives in the depths and is stirred to activity in the darkest time of the year. And then Easter, know thyself. So really, really beautiful series of lectures. And then he brings it all the way to the end with the statement from the being of the Christ. This do in remembrance of me. So this is placed into the context of creating a cosmic ritual, of becoming festival creating, of doing the esoteric out of reading the cycle of the year. So what I intend to do then is to share with you what I do with this. I'm not suggesting that we all have to do this, and I'm going to apologize in advance if it comes as a lot of content. I tried to break it down and make it really simple. At this point in the cycle of the year, we're still experiencing the arrival of the growth forces. All of the souls that were incarnate are gathering into the moon sphere. So I imagine that these things are like seed ideas. Not all of them will take root and bear fruit. But at this point in the cycle of the year, it's like, let's just look ahead and see what might be sounding in the star picture. How can I find meaning for it in what I know now, but in a free way? I want to hold it, but I want to hold it freely so that it can show up. But I want to say, I'm starting to create a place for you to come. So what I'm watching in the star picture, these 5 things. So right now we're at the cross quarter time. So I want to touch on Comet ZTF. Then I want to look at the vernal full moon, which is the first full moon after the spring equinox, which is used for determining the date of Easter each year. In these lectures, Rudolf Steiner talks about how that kind of arrangement for finding Easter has to do with first the spatial element. What is the spatial relationship between Earth and moon and sun? And once you find yourself in space, in relationship, and that the sun and moon have traded places in the hemispheres, this is a spatial dynamic, then it gets placed into time when you say the festival happens on the sun day. So I want to look at, each year I look at where does that moon happen in that cycle of time. Then I want to look at the total solar eclipse that's coming on April 20th that will happen in the southern hemisphere. There's a full moon at Michaelmas, and then the annular solar eclipse that's coming in October. So it's kind of a tall order, and I'm going to try not to sprint through it all. But again, these are seed thoughts. These aren't the only things that are happening in the year. These are the things that I'm looking at, and I'm going to hopefully be able to demonstrate why I'm looking at them. So first I want to talk about the comet, and I can't remember who it was about asking me where it is right now, Nancy, if it was you. So this is a picture that comes from Sky and Telescope magazine, so showing where the comet has recently been. So it's February 1st right now, and at least according to what I've been reading, the comet is actually closest to us right now, so at its perigee. So it was discovered last year on March 2nd, and it was seen in deep space telescopes before it became something that could be seen with backyard telescopes, and now it has come into naked eye visibility. So it started to really become something that amateur astronomers and non-astronomers alike could begin to see as it was coming through in front of the region of Corona Borealis, which is the starry crown. And then it seemed to slide along this region that marks the tail of Draco the dragon. And now it's aiming toward Capella, which is in the region of the constellation Auriga the charioteer. So it went closest to the sun on January 12th. It's closest to us today. I like to share these dates because if you keep a journal, it's really interesting to look and see, like to go back around January 12th and say, can I find the comet? Like, is something happening in my life that might suggest that this has got something to do with me? But I would also The reason I'm pointing out where it is this way is because I find something, I'm totally biased this way, but this coming into view in the region of the crown potentially suggests the kings. And I think I saw Brian's name on there. Brian shared a beautiful, beautiful research and an experience that he had with the star Capella in relationship to the Nathan Jesus child that is described in the Luke gospel. And the child that is described in the Luke gospel is announced to the shepherds, and that this is connected to the warmth of the heart. And so Capella is potentially connected to the warmth of the shepherd's heart. So we have the corona, which suggests the crown, the king, and then Capella, which suggests the heart. And this comet moving from this region of the starry crown toward what I'll right now call a shepherd's star has gone along this path that took it along the tail of the dragon. And this is really remarkable to think of as an imagination about how do we get from head to heart or from heart to head. In this, I think about the great red window at the Goetheanum and this image that's in the central panel and the being of Michael at the base or the heart region of that large being that's at the center of that panel, taming the dragon in the heart. So I'm allowing myself to imagine this behind what potentially this starry messenger, this comet, is carrying toward us. But of course, it requires researching in my own life. Is anything happening that might suggest that that is so? So also in looking at what a comet does, one of the things that Rudolf Steiner describes is that a comet can be like it's like it's sweeping up the astrality. And I find this a lovely relationship to this in the lectures that he gave on the spiritual individualities of the planets, where he's describing the planets that are connected to the destiny forces of the human being and those that are connected to liberating forces. And then at the end of this lecture, he gives a description of the role of the sun in mediating between the forces of destiny and the forces of liberation. And what happens to those forces that we as human beings on the earth are making use of that could potentially be a misuse of our destiny forces. So I think of this potentially as being related to this kind of astrality that might be picked up by a comet and taken toward the sun to be dealt with. So I just want to read this passage that comes at the very end of these lectures that were given in July of 1923. We can grasp the nature of the sun only when we know something of its nature of spirit and soul. In that realm, it is the power which imbues with warmth the element of necessity in destiny, resolves destiny into freedom in its flame, and if freedom is misused, condenses it once more into its own active substance. The sun is, as it were, the flame in which freedom becomes a luminous reality in the universe. And at the same time, the sun is the substance in which, as condensed ashes, misused freedom is molded into destiny, until destiny itself can become luminous and pass over into the flame of freedom. So I think it's possible to imagine that this is happening when we cross through the threshold of death and as a soul spiritual being are moving through the planetary spheres, through the sun sphere and the time between death and rebirth. But I'm also allowing myself to imagine that when a comet comes through our planetary system, it's possible that it also is gathering up these misused forces and taking them toward the sun. And I don't want this to seem trite, but it's also interesting to me that March 2nd in 2022, when this Comet ZTF for the Zwicky Transient Facility there at Palomar College, where it was discovered, March 2nd in 2022 was Ash Wednesday. So that just sounds a little bell to me. We're dealing with ashes here. We're dealing with ashes. At least in the anthroposophical community, 2022 was looking at flame and ashes. I'm not going to claim this comet for us, but just to say, you know, there's something about when it appears, when is it coming into our consciousness? What is the cultural context that we can give for understanding this phenomena? We can look at it through the lens of science and try to describe the elements that, and, you know, try to describe the trajectory and how many billions of years it's been since it's come through our system, but then also to look into our own cultural history and see, is it saying anything? So I see where it is, when it's coming, this idea about the forces of these misused forces of freedom, how they are condensed into ashes, how the sun takes that for us and resubstantiates it. Also, the comet is closest to us today. Here's another picture. This one comes from Michigan State University Abrams Planetarium, so that you can see it's gone just past, it was between the dippers. And today, Wednesday, February 1st, it's moved beyond the region of the dippers and it's aiming toward Capella. It doesn't have, Mars is not on this map, but just after this, it's going to be quite close to Mars as well. So today, February 1st, is close to the cross quarter time. I think technically it's tomorrow, February 2nd, also known as Groundhog's Day, also known as Candlemas Day. But this also marks the point in the season about 40 days after the solstice time, the darkest time of the year, when after the days of purification have been fulfilled, Mary in the Luke gospel takes the Christ child to the temple to be offered, and there Simeon prophesies over the child. This is Rembrandt's painting of Simeon's Song of Praise. Rembrandt painted this in 1669, and just this passage from the Luke gospel. Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared before me, before the face of all people, a light to lighten the Gentiles and the glory of thy people Israel. So again, trying to look at, with this in the background, this idea that we are to live with the being of the year, we are to do the esoteric, we are to become festival creating. Is it possible that a comet that's sweeping closest to the Earth on a day when we would be observing this point in the cycle of the year, that it might have something to do with this mystery? It's a question. Also, Simeon says to Mary at this time, a sword shall pierce thy soul, that the thoughts and the hearts of many may be revealed. And this is one of several places where it's described how she keeps this in her heart. So I've been thinking about this comet coming into the consciousness, at least in the scientific community, on Ash Wednesday, breaking into a closer and more accessible visibility at the starry crown, moving along the tail of the dragon, coming closest to us at this cross quarter time, and going toward the star connected to the shepherds, that potentially it has to do with this mystery of the quiet heart, of holding something within the heart and listening in the cycle of the year for that which would speak, as Simeon speaks over the child. Okay, so now one more picture I want to share. This was shared with me recently from a gentleman in Hungary who had reached out in response to an email. I just thought this was a really, really lovely picture. So this is Comet ZTF, which I have not yet seen from northern Michigan. We have not had clear skies, so I'm just seeing pictures that are being posted, but this one was really, really dramatic. All right, next. And if there's questions about these things afterward, I can see there are some things in the chat, but I'm not going to look at that right now, Sandra, unless there's something there that you think I need to look for. So I'm going to move on. The next thing I wanted to consider is the vernal full moon. And I'm just going to share with you that I was born at the vernal full moon. So even though the vernal full moon does not recur on my birthday every single year, you've probably heard me say before, I feel like the vernal full moon is mine. So just going to put that on the table there. So the vernal full moon is the first full moon that happens after the vernal equinox. So the sun has come above the celestial equator from our perspective on the Earth. The celestial equator is Earth's equator projected out onto the star field so that we can talk about what's above it and what's below it. And from our perspective, it appears to us that the sun is moving. So it looks to us at the spring equinox in the northern hemisphere that the sun comes above the celestial equator. But we don't celebrate the return of the sun. I mean, we can celebrate the return of the sun, but the sacred festival of Easter is not happening the moment the sun returns. Rudolf Steiner says the right witness has to be there. And the right witness for the return of the sun is the moon. And every full moon is going to be exactly opposite the sun. So if the sun has returned above the celestial equator, the full moon is going to be below. So there's something quite special that happens the moment that moon comes full. It's as though the switch is completed. And so that sounds a note. That full moon always happens during the Holy Week because Easter Sunday will be the first Sunday after that full moon. So it's always within 6 or 7 days of that full moon. So this year, that full moon is going to happen overnight, Wednesday, April 5th to Thursday, April 6th. So in my time zone, I'm in the Eastern time zone, it's going to happen at 12:26 a.m. on April 6th. So it will still be April 5th for you folks out in the Pacific time zone. So each year I look at that full moon and I say, all right, if Easter is the beginning of the spiritual new year, does this moon show us anything about what this spiritual new year is going to be about? And then I look to see where in the week is it happening, and then what is occurring in the narrative of that week that might be emphasized by that moon. So this year, that moon happening overnight, Wednesday to Thursday, draws attention to the event that's described in the Gospels. I'm going to give it to us from the Mark Gospel, which is of the woman with the alabaster box of oil that she breaks open and anoints the head of the Christ. And in the Mark Gospel, it's described how all of the disciples get really riled up about this. Couldn't the oil, it's so valuable, couldn't it have been sold and the money given to the poor? And this is the activity that ultimately leads to Judas making the decision to betray the Christ. So this happens overnight, Wednesday to Thursday, that Judas covenants to betray the Christ. So this year, 2023, the vernal full moon is going to happen overnight, Wednesday to Thursday. So for me, this it suggests that this is an important story to take a look at. Not that 2023 is going to be about betrayal, but potentially it can draw our attention toward the true nature of this being, Judas. What was he serving? What did he do? How has it lived? How has it sounded through the ages? What becomes? And is it happenstance where that moon falls in the cycle of the Holy Week? Or is it drawing our attention to something for a particular reason? So I'm not trying to make a prediction about what 2023 is going to be about. I'm just asking a question. Out of this sense that we are to become festival creating, is it possible that paying attention to where that moon happens can have something to do with how I observe Easter this year? It's a big question, but I think that we owe it to ourselves and also to the indications from Rudolf Steiner and from his exhortation to us to do the esoteric, that we draw this kind of thing into our attention and use it as part of the way that we inform and create our festivals. Then also, because I've got this Rembrandt thing going, I wanted to show one of Rembrandt's first images, which was a painting. First, he did it as a pen and ink sketch, and then this painting of Judas returning the 30 pieces of silver. So overnight, Wednesday to Thursday, he covenants to betray the Christ. Thursday, the Last Supper occurs. The Christ being breaks the curfew, goes out into the garden at Gethsemane. Judas has gone out and gotten the guards, and then the betrayal happens there. And then after the crucifixion, he has this overwhelming sense of what he has done, and he wants to return the silver. And he's torn out his hair. This is a really powerful moment. And after this moment, then he hangs himself. It's devastating, but also it's something that I think it's worth considering. The moon is going to be full overnight that night. Okay. Now, the next piece that I'm looking at, that one's pretty sobering, but just to place it there as something to consider as we're at this point in the cycle of the year, looking ahead into the year, looking into the festival cycle, the comet, it's coming close to us right now, the vernal full moon, and then in April, the eclipse season begins. So we'll have eclipses every single year, twice a year. Sometimes up to 6 eclipses will occur. The first eclipse that's happening in 2023 will happen on April 20th, and it will be a total solar eclipse called the Ningalo eclipse because of the area in Australia, where it will occur. So we won't be seeing this in North America. In fact, you have to be in a really remote place in Australia to see it. Nonetheless, it serves to know when the eclipses are happening. What is really interesting about this eclipse for me is that April 20th marks the 99th anniversary of the first time the foundation stone meditation was ever performed in eurythmy. So the fire happened in 1922, in which the first Goetheanum was destroyed. Rudolf Steiner kept going. In Christmas 1923 to New Year's Day 1924, the Christmas conference was held. Immediately at the conclusion of the Christmas conference on January 1st, 1924, he began creating the forms for the foundation stone meditation, which had just been placed into the hearts of those who were called toward anthroposophy as a life path. And now he spent the next 4 months preparing it in eurythmy for it to be performed on Easter Sunday, April 20th, 1924. So April 20th, 2023 marks the 99th anniversary of that event. So 3 times 33 years this year, and there will be a total solar eclipse. So I think about this deed of Rudolf Steiner's. It's a very high expression of the word. It's a demonstration of how the human being is to speak to the stars. So the stars spoke once to man verse is given to Marie Steiner on Christmas Day, 1922. A week later, the fire happens. A year later, the foundation stone meditation is spoken for the human being, but to the stars, and then given as a eurythmy form, which would also be a very high expression of a speaking to the stars. So I imagine that on April 20th, 1924, as sun and earth are standing in a particular relationship with one another, Rudolf Steiner is making a cosmic inscription. And he says this: such is the writing of the stars, by our own deeds inscribed into the cosmic spaces. So it's possible, I think, to consider that April 20th is uniquely related to the foundation stone meditation as it's being spoken to the cosmos. So this year will mark its 99th anniversary. Next year will be the 100th anniversary of the foundation stone meditation being given in eurythmy. And then in 2025, which marks the 100th anniversary year of Rudolf Steiner's death, Easter will recur on April 20th. So we have this coming together again. It was Easter Sunday, the very first time the foundation stone meditation was performed in eurythmy. In 2025, it will happen on Easter Sunday again. I think that this is really, really remarkable. It's an experience that selfishly I want to have. the foundation stone in eurythmy on that day for the next 3 years at least. So Rudolf Steiner, in the lecture series that he was giving in 1924, so remember this is, so I'm going back now. So the Christmas conference concluded on January 1st, 1924. Easter 1924, Rudolf Steiner was giving the lectures, the Easter mystery in the evolution, the Easter festival in the evolution of the mysteries. And he begins by saying, we can say that the original purpose of festivals is to make human beings look up from their dependence on earthly things to their dependence on extra earthly things, to become festival creating, to do the esoteric, to enact the cosmic ritual. He's saying these words on the day, the first day that the foundation stone was performed in eurythmy. Something that can take us from the earth into an imagination and an experience of extra earthly things. Okay, that was the third thing on my list. The fourth thing that I'm looking at is that this year at Michaelmas, we'll have a full moon. This is the harvest moon this year. Harvest moon is always the full moon closest to the autumn equinox, which means that sometimes it happens before equinox, sometimes it happens after. This year it's happening afterward at Michaelmas. So I have this image from Raphael of Saint Michael and the dragon. In the lectures in the cycle of the year, Rudolf Steiner is really specific about creating a Michael festival that has a relationship to courage and inner uprightness and the ability of the human being really to recognize how, yes, we live in the natural environment, but we are not of that, and we don't wane and diminish in the fall the same way the natural world does, but that this is when the human being begins to stir to wakefulness. What's interesting to me about the first moon that's coming after the autumn equinox is that it anticipates the vernal full moon in the coming year. And I hope that this isn't confusing, but this full moon on September 29th, 2023 at Michaelmas will be in the same place that the sun will be 6 months later, and the sun is where the moon will be, and there will be trading places in the hemisphere during the Holy Week in the year coming. Okay, so this moon anticipates the 2024 vernal full moon in that the sun and moon occupy their specific places at Michaelmas, and then they switch for the vernal full moon the coming year. So already at Michaelmas this year, we can, I think, anticipate out of the harvest and the beginning of the in-breath, something that's connected to the mystery of Easter 2024. So these are the kinds of things that I think help us to live with the whole being of the year, not just one season, but to look across the seasons, to look in the rhythm of the cycle of, it could be a 9-month, the way there's the 9-month gestation of the human being, but then also looking at this rhythm with the eclipses, looking at the rhythms of the moon and how they sound to one another across the cycle of the year. This one I think is really worth paying attention to. Full moon at Michaelmas, anticipating the full moon that will happen at the vernal full moon in the coming year. April 20, I put April 25th. I meant to say March 25th, so I want to apologize. So where it says there, the vernal full moon, April 25th, it's March 25th. The vernal full moon will happen on March 25th. And I see that I repeated the mistake again because March 25th is the Feast of Annunciation. So I apologize for the confusion that may have caused. The September 29th full moon anticipates the vernal full moon, which will happen March 25th, 2024. March 25th each year is the Feast of the Annunciation. So the description again in the Luke Gospel of the Archangel Gabriel coming to Mary to announce that should she accept this Annunciation, she will bear the Christ child. So this is the beginning. This is something that's happening just prior to the Easter mystery and the cycle of the year, and it predates Christmas by exactly 9 months. So again, we've got the Michaelmas moon anticipating the vernal full moon, and the vernal full moon happening at the Feast of Annunciation 9 months ahead of Christmas. So this starts to build a way through the cycle of the year. It's a lot to hold on to, but I think if it speaks to you, it's something to pay attention to, and to ask this question. I ask the question, is there something different about Michaelmas when we've got a full moon? Is there something that wants to be experienced or brought into how I will celebrate and observe that festival? At the Goetheanum, they're doing the World Festival at Michaelmas this year. So that full moon will happen while that event is going on. And again, I apologize. The vernal full moon in 2024 will be on March 25th. And the Feast of Annunciation is March 25th. Okay, the final thing I wanted to look at is the annular solar eclipse that will be happening on October 14th. So an annular eclipse happens when the moon is at that place on its orbital path that's farthest away from us. So the moon isn't just circling the earth, it's moving in an ellipse. And so this means that sometimes it's close to us and sometimes it's further away. When it comes full really close to us, these days that's referred to as super moon. But when we have a new moon that's far away from us, that's causing an eclipse, it's far enough away that it doesn't entirely block the sun, but it appears to stand within the sun's corona, and we get what's called a ring of fire. So eclipses are, this particular eclipse is coming through Oregon. I don't know which city it's going to make landfall, but then it's going to move from the west toward the south, moving southeast. It's going to go right over Los Alamos in New Mexico, and then through Texas, and then out of America. But then you can see it goes across the Gulf of Mexico. It continues on that path. So eclipses are organized in something that's called a Saros cycle. And this is, I'm going to say it this way, related to eclipses that will occur in front of the same region of stars, although that will shift over time. And the eclipses that belong to one Saros cycle will be separated from one another by about 18 years and 11 days. Now, eclipses will happen when the moon is new or full close to its nodal point. So that's where these planes of orbit intersect and things line up, and you've got the moon when it's new, blocking the sun, or if it's full, it's standing in the shadow of the earth. So on October 14th, it's new moon, kind of far away from Earth, blocking the sun. So we've got this ring of fire eclipse, and this eclipse belongs to Saros number 134. So the reason I'm paying attention to this is because of the other dates in which eclipses in this Saros have occurred. So this eclipse Saros began in 1248, so in the Middle Ages. It recurs every 18 plus years. I'm just picking out the dates that I think are really remarkable in this particular eclipse cycle. It occurred again in 1861, 1879, 1915, and 1933. So 1248, there's a lot that can be said about that period of history. I'm just going to point to that this is the time when Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas are doing their work together in, I'm going to say Cologne, I think it's pronounced Köln in Germany. 1861 is the year that Rudolf Steiner was born. 1879, we have the beginning of the age of Michael with the fall of the spirits of darkness. In 1915, World War I was still happening. The first Goetheanum was still being built. In 1933, Rudolf Steiner had given an indication beginning in 1910 that in a lecture that he gave in 1910, about the great mystery of our time, which has to do with the reappearance of the Christ being in the etheric. He points to the decade of the 1930s as the time when this will begin, specifically to 1933. So this is sounding in this eclipse Saros. And this particular eclipse Saros is about to recur. So I want to pay attention to that. And if I ask myself, do I dare try to create cosmic ritual in relationship to this? Is this something that provides an opportunity to become festival creating? How do I do the esoteric in relationship to this? Given the information, given the dates, given the potential for what is related to this eclipse Saros. There's something I think quite fascinating about eclipses. A Saros will begin when the eclipse begins to cast its shadow over the southernmost limb of the earth. And then the eclipse path will shift up, they shift north, and they keep going until then the shadow is falling over the northernmost part of the earth, and then it's not happening on the earth anymore. That will take many centuries. So eclipse Saroses will last for a long, long time. And I did not put the dates of every single eclipse that's in this Saros cycle. I just picked out the ones that really spoke strongly to me as an anthroposophist. So I share this really as an invitation for contemplation and getting it 9 months ahead of time. It's like, okay, do I live in the path of the eclipse? I don't have to be in the path of the eclipse to be able to do something about eclipse, or to perhaps take up a particular study, to make a decision about what I might do. Rudolf Steiner gave interesting descriptions about what eclipses are and do and can be for the human being. And the lecture is Human Questions and Cosmic Answers. And looking at the clock, I'm not gonna give that description right now unless somebody asks me for it if there's time for question and answer. So I would just like to close with my last slide with this statement that I had at the beginning from what Rudolf Steiner said during the final lecture that was given in the first Goetheanum on New Year's Eve in 1922. The first beginning. And I think this reveals what I think cosmic ritual means. To me, it means I better pay attention to what's going on in the celestial world as part of what informs what I'm doing. The first beginning of what must come to pass if anthroposophy is to fulfill its mission in the world is that man's whole relationship to the world must be recognized to be one of cosmic ritual. So with those 5 events, celestial events, that's what I'm looking at right now. So the comet right now, the vernal full moon, the total solar eclipse in April that's happening coincident with the day that the foundation stone was first performed in Eurythmy, the full moon at Michaelmas, and then this annular eclipse that comes in October.